Imagine for a moment being far from any coast, hundreds of miles out on the open water, with no refrigerator, no shop to buy provisions, and the only food available being whatever was crammed into a wooden barrel 6 months earlier. This was the daily routine for every pirate who ever sailed the seas. Not the romanticized Hollywood fantasy of endless rum, piles of gold, and swashbuckling sword fights. No, this was the stark reality. Breakfast might be a biscuit hard as a rock and crawling with insects, lunch a cut of meat that reeked like a wet dog, and dinner more or less the same, though perhaps you'd douse it in alcohol first to make it a little less stomach-churning. Yet, these men survived this diet. Some even thrived on it, sailing across entire oceans and returning to do it all over again. So what exactly did they manage to eat? And how on earth did any of it actually keep them alive? Let's begin with the one item found on every pirate ship without fail: salted meat. Typically beef or pork, chopped into sizable pieces, then buried under mounds of coarse salt inside wooden barrels. These barrels were sealed tightly and stowed away in the darkest, coolest corners of the ship's hold. This wasn't merely a way to keep food from spoiling. It was, in its own primitive fashion, a science. Salt works relentlessly, drawing moisture out of the meat through a process no one named, but everyone understood. Without that moisture, bacteria found nothing to feed on, nothing grew, nothing rotted. The meat simply remained, suspended in time, perfectly edible for half a year, a full year, or even longer, assuming the conditions inside the barrel stayed right. Pirates relied on this method absolutely. A ship crossing the Atlantic might spend months between ports, and without that salted meat, the crew would surely starve long before sighting land. But there was a significant drawback. By the time this meat was ready to be eaten, it had absorbed so much salt it was almost impossible to swallow. We're not talking about something a little on the salty side. This was meat that had been packed under so much salt you couldn't even see the meat itself, left to sit in brine for weeks or even months. Its texture often felt more like leather than food. To make it remotely palatable, pirates had to soak it in fresh water for hours, sometimes an entire day, just to draw out enough of the salt so a person could eat it without immediately dying of thirst. Even after all that effort, the meat remained tough, intensely salty, and often tasted like it had been through a long, hard fight. In a way, it had. The integrity of these barrels was a constant worry for both the ship's cook and the captain. Wooden barrels, by their nature, were never perfectly sealed. If seawater seeped in, the delicate balance of the curing brine would be thrown off, leading the meat to spoil completely. A ruined barrel wasn't just a culinary disappointment. It was a potential death sentence for a crew counting on it. So pirates watched over their meat with the same obsessive care they devote to a ship sailing into enemy waters. Each barrel was inspected, every seam checked, and the hold kept as dry as humanly possible on a wooden vessel plying the Atlantic. Now imagine pairing that tough, salty meat with the other universal staple of pirate meals, hardtack. Here, perhaps, you begin to understand why so many sailors turned to piracy simply for a change of pace, because the food certainly offered no appeal. Hardtack was bread stripped down to its most basic, brutal form: flour, water, and a pinch of salt. These ingredients were mixed, rolled flat, cut into squares, and then baked not once, but multiple times, until every last drop of moisture had been utterly driven out. The result was genuinely something akin to an edible stone. There are stories of sailors using old hardtack as wedges under furniture, as makeshift building materials, or even as projectiles in a pinch. When it was fresh from a port baker, it was merely very hard. After a few months at sea, it became something else entirely. And it had another problem that went far beyond its mere hardness: weevils. These tiny beetles possessed an uncanny knack for finding their way into hardtack, setting up permanent homes inside, burrowing through the biscuits and laying their eggs within. An experienced pirate wouldn't simply eat hardtack. He'd tap it first, listening for the hollow sound that signaled insect activity. Some pirates would even eat in dim light on purpose, because seeing exactly what was crawling out of their dinner made it significantly harder to finish. The common practice was to soak hardtack before eating, in water and weak beer and whatever liquid was available, until it softened enough to be chewed, without risking a broken tooth. Clever cooks might crumble it into stews or fry pieces in fat, trying to coax it towards something that at least resembled food in texture, if not in flavor. When it came to liquids, here's a fact that often surprises people. Pirates drank alcohol not primarily because they were wild hedonists, but because it was a medical necessity. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels soured quickly. Within 2 or 3 weeks of leaving port, a barrel of fresh water could easily be growing algae, teeming with bacteria, turning green and slimy, and becoming completely unsafe to drink. The ocean, of course, offered an endless supply of water that no one could consume. So what did they drink? Beer, specifically weak beer, brewed to perhaps 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough to kill off the harmful microorganisms that would otherwise lead to dysentery. Every pirate ship carried enormous quantities of it. Being mildly persistently under the influence of alcohol wasn't just a consequence of pirate life, it was a deliberate strategy for survival. When the beer ran out or wasn't available, there was grog. Rum diluted with water, sometimes with lime juice added. This addition brings us to one of the most vital nutritional discoveries in maritime history. No one on a pirate ship in the 1600s understood vitamins. They didn't grasp the mechanics of scurvy. They only knew that on long voyages men would start losing their teeth. Gums would swell and blacken. Old wounds, long healed, would mysteriously reopen. Eventually men died, and yet somehow crews that drank grog with lime juice didn't suffer from it as severely. The captains who gradually figured this out, a process that took generations, essentially saved thousands of lives without ever understanding the underlying biochemistry. Vitamin C was the answer. Citrus was the way it was delivered, and rum was the agreeable vehicle that made men willing to consume it. Beans rarely received the credit they deserve in the history of piracy. Dried legumes, black beans, navy beans, chickpeas, dried peas, were caloric gold for ships operating with strict budgets and even tighter storage space. Their economic value was extraordinary. A small sack of dried beans occupied minimal space, weighed very little for its nutritional content, cost almost nothing at port, and could last for months, even years, provided it stayed dry. Preparation was simple, though time-consuming. Beans needed to soak for hours before cooking, requiring advanced planning. But once cooked in a communal pot over a ship's fire, they could feed an entire crew. The real problem was the sheer monotony. Beans every day, every week, every month. The same texture, the same flavor, the same dull color in the bowl. For men already enduring hardtack, salt leather meat, and watered-down rum, The psychological burden of eating the exact same meal repeatedly was a unique form of suffering. This perhaps explains why spices, without exaggeration, were often more valuable than most of the treasure pirates actually stole. Here is a truth about piracy that often goes unnoticed. A significant portion of pirate attacks on merchant vessels were driven not by the lure of gold or silver, but by the trading cargo the ships carried, specifically spices. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg. These weren't just simple seasonings, they were transformative. A handful of black pepper could genuinely make salt leathery beef taste like actual food. Cloves possessed natural anesthetic qualities, helping to ease the chronic toothaches that tormented sailors living on nothing but preserved rations. Cinnamon offered a touch of sweetness without relying on sugar, which was both scarce and costly. The psychological power of spices was immense, and often deeply underestimated by historians who focus solely on glittering treasure. After weeks of consuming the same gray, salt-heavy, weevil-adjacent meals, a dish that carried the scent of cinnamon or the warm bite of pepper could uplift crew morale more powerfully than a successful raid. Ship's cooks, who understood how to effectively use their spice supply, were highly valued members of the crew, sometimes even more protected than the first mate. Their precious spices were kept in sealed metal tins and wooden boxes, safeguarded from the humidity and rats that would destroy them, watched over like the genuine treasure they truly were. Occasionally, and only occasionally, pirates found themselves truly fortunate. A successful raid on a merchant vessel making its way from the Caribbean might yield a bounty of fresh fruit, oranges, mangoes, bananas, the entire tropical harvest that most of Northern Europe had never even tasted. The moment crates of fresh oranges appeared on a pirate ship, the entire atmosphere would shift. Men who had been grinding through weeks of salted protein and hardtack were suddenly holding something that felt alive in their hands. Sweet and tart and bursting with juice, something that didn't need soaking or boiling or rehydrating or holding up to the light to check for infestations. The desperate rush to consume fresh fruit before it spoiled was a kind of controlled chaos. Tropical heat worked quickly, and a crate of mangoes that was perfect on Monday could easily be fermenting by Thursday. Every seasoned pirate understood this, so fresh fruit was never savored slowly. It was eaten immediately, enthusiastically, and often messily, with juice streaming down beards that hadn't seen fresh water in weeks. Dried fruit served as a poor substitute between raids, raisins, figs, dates, offering concentrated sugar and calories, and a distant echo of something that once grew under a real sun. They lasted for months in sealed barrels and were carefully rationed, appearing in cooking as sweeteners, as energy boosts before a battle, or simply as something that tasted utterly different from everything else. The same approach to raiding extended to other luxury proteins. Live animals on a ship were simultaneously a logistical nightmare and an invaluable treasure. Chickens proved the most practical, small, relatively low maintenance, and producers of fresh eggs as long as they remained alive. A dozen chickens on a pirate ship could mean fresh eggs for weeks, followed by meat at the end.
The arithmetic worked out well if one could manage to keep them alive on rolling seas, which was never a certainty. Pigs were larger and offered more meat, but they consumed proportionally more resources and occupied significantly more space. Goats provided milk for weeks before their eventual slaughter,
extending their value considerably. Managing these animals fell to specific crew members who understood that their charges were worth more alive than dead, at least for the time being. The timing of slaughter required careful consideration. Fresh meat spoiled incredibly fast in tropical climates, so an animal was only killed when conditions allowed for most of it to be consumed immediately or preserved quickly. A sick chicken wasn't just a loss of future eggs. It posed a potential contamination risk for the entire crew in a confined space with no hospital and a ship's surgeon, whose medical toolkit consisted largely of rum and optimism. Eggs deserve their own moment of recognition, because in the strict hierarchy of pirate food, a fresh egg was essentially royalty. Eggs could last 2 to 4 weeks without refrigeration if handled with care, packed in salt, sawdust, or cloth to prevent breakage, and they could be prepared in a multitude of ways: boiled, fried, stirred into stews, scrambled with dried herbs. After months of food that demanded extensive processing, soaking, and preparation just to become edible, an egg was instant, fresh, and genuinely good. Pirates developed elaborate testing rituals for egg quality, cracking carefully, smelling first, checking the color of the yolk, because a rotten egg in the sealed confines of a ship's interior was a unique kind of misery. Hard cheese was the dairy product robust enough to survive the ocean crossing. Aged varieties like cheddar, whose low moisture content and natural rind gave them weeks or even months of shelf life. A cheese wheel stored in the coolest, driest section of the hold offered not only nutrition but something that approached genuine culinary pleasure, a rich, complex taste that hinted at a different world. There exists another category of preserved food that seldom gets mentioned but was absolutely ubiquitous on pirate ships: pickled fish. Herring, cod, anchovies, whatever local catches were available when the ship took on provisions. The pickling process, submerging fish in vinegar brine or heavily salted liquid, created something aggressively flavorful, yet durable for months, providing essential protein when meat supplies dwindled. Mediterranean pirates often carried pickled anchovies, small and intensely salty but rich in fat and flavor. Atlantic pirates more frequently had pickled cod, which was larger and more substantial. The vinegar that preserved them also did something unexpected. It imparted a sharp, acidic note to the food, cutting through the monotonous, salt-heavy flavor profile that dominated virtually everything else on the ship. Pirates who had been eating nothing but salt meat and hardtack for weeks would actually crave the sourness of pickled fish, much the way a modern person might long for something refreshing and cold. Preparation was minimal. Rinse, eat, done. This sheer convenience alone made pickled fish invaluable in a food environment where almost everything else required extensive preparation before it was even marginally edible. Nuts essentially served as the original energy bars. Almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, packed with calories and healthy fats, protected by their own shells from moisture and pests, and compact enough to store in large quantities within minimal space. A pirate could simply tuck a handful of almonds into a pocket before climbing the rigging and have immediate, no preparation required energy available for hours. The shell functioned as the packaging, the preservation, and the portion control all in one. Crews, originating from different coastal regions, brought various nut varieties, which naturally led to small but genuine trading opportunities when pirate ships happened to encounter one another. And then there was slush. If one truly wishes to grasp the depths of desperation shipboard food could reach, one need only consider slush, the gray, congealed fat that would rise to the surface when salted meat was boiled. Under ordinary circumstances, it would be skimmed off and discarded. But on a ship running low on provisions, nothing was ever discarded. That fat was painstakingly collected, stored in sealed containers, and then used to fry other foods, enrich meager stews, or spread on hardtack as a vital calorie supplement. The very phrase slush fund actually stems from this practice. Any extra slush sold at port contributed to a ship's discretionary cash. The psychological difficulty of eating it was documented by sailors who wrote that even extreme hunger had to contend with the visceral revulsion of looking at gray, congealed animal fat and deliberately putting it into one's mouth. The men who could manage that without flinching had, perhaps, the strongest stomachs in all of maritime history. What emerges from all of these details isn't merely a tale of primitive people eating poorly because they knew no better. It's something far more intriguing, a narrative of individuals operating under extraordinary constraints who developed surprisingly sophisticated systems for nutrition, morale, and sheer survival. They didn't have the science of food, but they devised practical equivalents through relentless trial and error. They didn't understand what vitamins were, yet they figured out which foods prevented specific diseases. They had no refrigeration, but they grasped the power of salt, fermentation, drying, and alcohol as preservation tools with remarkable precision. And they understood something that modern food culture sometimes forgets, that after weeks of the same gray, salt-heavy, survival-oriented meals, a single ingredient, one handful of spices, one crate of oranges, one fresh egg, could utterly change everything. Not just physically, but psychologically. The right food, delivered at the right moment, could be the difference between a crew that fought with purpose and a crew that mutinied. It could determine whether men believed the voyage was worth finishing, or if they simply gave up hope. Pirates ate terribly by almost any modern standard. But they understood, perhaps better than most, exactly what food was truly for.